You did not fall in love suddenly. It didn't arrive like a storm or a revelation. It came quietly, disguised as comfort, familiarity, something that felt safe. You met me at a time when you were not searching for anything extraordinary. You were tired of expectations, tired of hope, tired of believing in stories that promised more than they delivered. I felt easy to be around. I felt familiar faster than I should have. You noticed how natural it felt to talk to me, how conversations stretched without effort, how silence didn't feel threatening. You told yourself that was rare. You told yourself that was enough. At first, you kept a distance, not wanting to name what you felt too quickly. You watched yourself carefully, checking every emotion, every impulse. But slowly, without asking your permission, I became part of your routine. You thought about me when something good happened. You thought about me when something hurt. You started measuring your days by moments that involved me, even when I wasn't there. You paid attention in ways that felt instinctive to you. You remembered details I forgot I had shared. You adjusted your tone to match my moods. You learned when to speak and when to stay quiet around me. Loving me began to feel like a skill you were developing, something you could get better at if you tried hard enough. You believed love was built through presence and understanding. You believed that if you showed up consistently, if you listened deeply, if you stayed kind even when it was difficult, something real would grow between us. I never asked you to do any of this, and that was the first imbalance, though you didn't see it yet. I accepted your attention the way people accept warmth in winter, gratefully, without questioning where it comes from or what it costs. I enjoyed being seen the way you saw me, without having to return that intensity. You mistook my comfort for connection. You mistook my availability for closeness. When we spent time together, you felt something solid for me. You felt chosen in small, subtle ways. A message answered quickly, a laugh shared at the right moment, a conversation that lasted longer than expected. You collected these moments like evidence, building a case inside yourself that this meant something. You ignored the absence of initiative on my side. You ignored how rarely I moved toward you first. You told yourself everyone loves differently. You told yourself patience was part of care. You didn't realize yet that you were slowly training yourself to accept less, to quiet parts of yourself that wanted more. Loving me felt peaceful at first. It felt mature. It felt like growth. You didn't know yet that love can feel calm right before it begins to hurt. At some point, you stopped asking yourself whether what you felt was love. The question dissolved on its own, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous: expectation. You didn't wake up one morning and decide to hope. Hope settled into you gradually, like a routine you never consciously chose. You began to assume I would be there, that I would respond, that I would remain part of your emotional landscape. My presence became something you relied on without admitting it to yourself. You noticed how your mood shifted depending on my attention, how easily a short message from me could lift you, how silence could pull you into overthinking. You told yourself it was normal, that closeness naturally creates attachment. You told yourself not to exaggerate what you felt, but inside you, something was already leaning forward, waiting. You started shaping yourself subtly around me. You chose words more carefully. You avoided topics that seemed to distance me. You learned which parts of yourself were welcomed and which ones made me pull back. And without realizing it, you began editing yourself accordingly. You called it compromise. You called it understanding. You didn't call it self-erasure, not yet. When we talked, you listened more than you spoke. When we disagreed, you softened your opinions. You wanted to be easy to love, even though I had never said I was trying to love you. There were moments when you felt close to saying something. Moments when the truth rose to the surface of your chest and pressed against your throat. But you swallowed it every time. You were afraid of breaking what you believed was still forming. You convinced yourself that timing mattered, that rushing would ruin everything. So you waited. Waiting became something you were good at. You waited for signs. You waited for reassurance. You waited for me to meet you halfway. And sometimes I gave you just enough to keep you there. A longer conversation, a softer tone, a moment of vulnerability that felt intimate to you and casual to me. You held on to those moments tightly, replaying them in your head, letting them justify everything else that felt uncertain. You didn't notice how much of your emotional energy was flowing in one direction. Or maybe you noticed and told yourself it was temporary. You believed that consistency would eventually turn into mutuality, that care would turn into affection, that proximity would turn into love. I didn't correct you, not because I was intentionally misleading you, but because your hope asked nothing from me directly. It existed quietly, politely, without demands, and that made it easy to ignore. I talked to you about my thoughts, my struggles, my light. You became someone I leaned on without considering what it meant to you. You were steady. You were available. You were emotionally fluent in ways that made things easier for me. You offered understanding without conditions. And slowly, unknowingly, you took on a role I never asked you to play but fully benefited from. You became the place I went to feel grounded without being the place I wanted to stay. You started imagining futures in which this dynamic changed, in which I finally saw you the way you saw me. Those futures felt realistic to you, not like fantasies, but like logical outcomes of effort and time. You didn't realize that love is not a reward for endurance. And by the time doubt began to surface, hope had already become a habit you didn't know how to break. There was no perfect moment to tell the truth, and you understood that long before you actually spoke. You waited anyway. You waited for certainty, for a sign that would make the risk feel justified, for a version of the future where your honesty would not cost you everything you had built inside yourself. But the weight of silence eventually became heavier than the fear of rejection. You noticed how often you stopped yourself mid-thought, how many emotions you stored away, how carefully you navigated conversations to avoid revealing too much. You realized that staying quiet was not protecting you anymore. It was trapping you. The day you decided to speak felt strangely calm, not hopeful, not dramatic, just inevitable. You told yourself that no matter the outcome, at least you would no longer be guessing. You chose your words with care, not to manipulate the outcome but to stay true to what you felt. When you told me you needed to talk, your voice remained steady even though your body didn't feel the same. You didn't confess in grand declarations. You didn't promise forever. You simply said that what you felt had grown beyond friendship, beyond comfort, beyond something you could keep pretending wasn't there. You said you cared deeply, that being close to me mattered in a way that felt honest and serious. You made space for me to respond. You didn't push. You didn't corner me with expectations. You just waited. I listened without interrupting. I didn't look shocked. I didn't look relieved. I looked thoughtful, which gave you a moment of fragile hope. You watched my face closely, searching for warmth, for hesitation, for anything that might suggest your feelings were shared. When I spoke, my tone was calm, careful, measured. I told you that I valued you, that you were important to me, that I appreciated your honesty. And then I told you that my feelings didn't match yours. I said I didn't experience our connection in the same way. I said I didn't want to mislead you or give you hope I couldn't fulfill. The words were gentle, but their effect was devastating. You felt the rejection not as a sharp blow, but as a sudden emptiness, like the floor disappearing beneath you without warning. You nodded as if you had expected this all along. You told me you understood. You even apologized as if your feelings were an inconvenience. You smiled out of reflex, your body performing normality while your mind struggled to catch up. Inside you, something fractured quietly. You didn't ask questions. You didn't demand explanations. You didn't try to convince me otherwise. You accepted my answer with a dignity that surprised even you. Afterward, you told yourself you felt relieved. Relieved to finally know. Relieved to stop guessing. But later, alone, the weight of what you had lost settled in. You realized that speaking had not ended your feelings. It had only removed the illusion that they might be returned. You lay awake replaying the conversation, not to change it but to understand it. You wondered if loving someone should ever feel this lonely. You wondered if honesty was always worth the cost. And somewhere in that quiet questioning, you understood that nothing would be the same again, no matter how much you tried to pretend otherwise. After the truth was spoken, you told yourself that leaving immediately would be dramatic, unnecessary, even immature. You believed that real strength meant staying calm, staying present, staying kind. You didn't want to punish me for not loving you back. You didn't want to make your feelings my burden. So you stayed. At first, it felt manageable. You convinced yourself that your emotions would settle, that time would soften them, that closeness without expectation could still be enough. You continued to talk to me, to listen, to support me the way you always had. You smiled when you were supposed to smile. You laughed when the moment asked for it. You learned how to hold your disappointment quietly, folding it inward so it wouldn't show. But staying required effort you hadn't anticipated. Every interaction carried a double meaning now. Every message reminded you of what had been said and what had been denied. You began to notice how unbalanced everything felt. How easily I leaned on you when I needed comfort, and how rarely I noticed when you were struggling. How natural it was for me to take your presence for granted, while you treated every moment with care. You became hyper-aware of your place in my life. Not central, not peripheral, but somewhere in between, close enough to give, far enough to be replaceable. Sometimes I talked about other possibilities, other people, other futures, and you listened as if your chest wasn't tightening with every word. You told yourself that being understanding was proof of maturity, but inside, you were slowly teaching yourself that your pain deserved silence. You stopped sharing parts of yourself that felt vulnerable. You filtered your honesty. You learned how to disappear emotionally while remaining physically present. Over time, exhaustion replaced hope. You felt tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. You started questioning who you were becoming in this version of closeness. You noticed how much of yourself you had reshaped just to remain acceptable. And yet, leaving still felt impossible. Not because you believed things would change, but because letting go meant admitting how much you had invested. Staying felt like loyalty. Leaving felt like failure. But the truth was quieter and more painful. Staying was slowly erasing you, and even as you felt yourself fading, part of you still hoped I would notice, still hoped I would reach out and stop you before you disappeared completely. Choosing yourself did not feel powerful at first. It didn't feel like clarity or victory. It felt like exhaustion making a decision on your behalf. You reached a point where continuing the way you had been felt heavier than the fear of change. You noticed how much energy it took just to maintain the appearance of being okay. How often you went quiet to avoid revealing too much. How often you swallowed words that wanted to be spoken. Slowly, you began to pull back, not as a statement, but as a form of self-preservation. You answered messages later. You stopped filling every silence. You allowed conversations to end without forcing them to continue. At first, you felt guilty, as if you were doing something wrong, as if you owed me the same level of presence you had always given. You questioned yourself constantly. You wondered if you were being unfair, if you were abandoning something important, if love was supposed to require this kind of sacrifice. But with distance came relief you hadn't expected. Your thoughts became quieter. Your chest felt lighter. You realized how much of your emotional world had revolved around someone who was never fully there. You didn't confront me. You didn't explain. You understood that explanations would only reopen wounds you were trying to heal. When I finally noticed the change, it was subtle. I asked if everything was okay, and you said yes. Because no felt like an invitation to return to a dynamic you were trying to leave behind. You weren't angry. You weren't resentful. You were simply tired of disappearing for someone who never asked you to stay whole. Stepping back felt like betrayal at first, then like honesty. You began reclaiming parts of yourself you had set aside. Your time, your attention, your emotional energy. You understood then that choosing yourself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. And even though it hurt, you knew you could no longer survive in a space where love was always one-sided. Life after leaving me felt strange at first, like stepping into a room you had always passed by but never entered. Silence became a companion you didn't have to manage. Your chest no longer tightened at every notification. Your mind no longer circled endlessly, trying to interpret every word, every pause, every laugh. There were moments when memories hit like a wave, sudden and sharp. A song, a phrase, a place, something that brought everything back in vivid detail. You missed me, not because I was perfect, but because you had invested so much of yourself in the idea of us. You grieved for the future that would never exist, for conversations that were never had, for love that you had given freely and without return. But slowly, you began to breathe again. You noticed how strong you had become, not because the rejection had ended, but because you had endured it and learned from it. You learned that love is not a currency to to be earned through patience or sacrifice. You learned that patience without reciprocity is not devotion, it is surrender. You learned that being chosen matters as much as choosing. You started to see yourself in moments of quiet pride, in small accomplishments, in laughter that was yours alone. You could think of me without your chest tightening, without the ache of longing that had once dominated your days. You understood, painfully but clearly, that I didn't reject you because you weren't enough. I rejected you because I was incapable of meeting the depth of what you offered, and that truth, as bitter as it was, became a kind of freedom. You no longer hoped for something that would never come. You no longer shaped yourself around someone else's feelings. You no longer carried the weight of loving someone who could not love you back. Life became yours again, and somewhere along the way, you realized that what you had learned from loving me, your patience, your empathy, your courage, your capacity to feel deeply, would guide you toward a love that did not ask you to disappear. When love finds you in the future, it will not be a test of endurance or silent sacrifice. It will be meeting fully, openly, without fear, without compromise of who you are. And even though part of you will always carry the memory of what was lost, you will carry it lightly, like a scar that reminds you how strong you became because you survived it, because you chose yourself, because you finally understood that the most important love is the one you give to yourself first.